There's a kind of silence you only find in orchards. Not the emptiness of still air or the hush before a storm, but a gentler breathing quiet, the soft rustle of leaves, the flutter of birds between branches, the creak of fruit-laden limbs swaying under summer weight. That was the sound I woke up to every morning on my hillside property, the home I bought 15 years ago when my wife and I thought we'd found our forever place. Back then, the hill was nothing but scraggly brush and dust. She was the one who saw the potential, said, "Let's grow something here. Let's give it a future." We planted every tree by hand, peach, apricot, cherry. She named them like children. She kept a journal of their growth like other women kept baby books. And after the cancer took her, I kept planting. It became my way of keeping her memory alive, of keeping myself alive. Neighbors called it the orchard on Ridgeview. Kids used to come by for buckets of peaches in July. I gave away fruit more than I ever sold. I didn't need to make money, I just needed it to be alive. Something good rooted in this world. The HOA never liked it. Not the fruit trees, not the mulch paths, not the old wooden fence I built myself. But for a long time, they left me alone. I wasn't part of their world. I didn't attend the meetings, didn't vote in board elections, didn't decorate for holidays. I kept to myself military habit. I had done my time as a logistics officer, and now I just wanted peace. But then Karen moved in. Top of the ridge. Big glass house, flat roof, manicured minimalist everything. She called it a showcase of suburban sophistication. It also meant she had the highest view in the HOA, except for my orchard. You couldn't even see her house from the road without walking through a gap in my trees. But that wasn't enough for her. She wanted an unobstructed panorama. She brought it up once at a community event, I think it was during the 4th of July barbecue 2 years ago. She made a passing joke about how lovely the ridge would look if it weren't so overgrown. I didn't laugh. A few months later, I got my first letter. HOA Stationery. Formal tone. You are in violation of CCNR Article 7.3 regarding landscape uniformity and maintenance. It claimed my orchard disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood, that it was non-compliant with standards of slope management and aesthetic cohesion. I stood there with that letter in my hand, staring at the signature. Karen A., Lansing, board president. I didn't even know she was on the board. At first, I wrote it off as noise, paper-pushing nonsense. I'd gotten a few of those letters in the past, mostly about paint color or mailbox size, and I'd ignored them. This felt the same. But then came the second letter, this one certified with a warning of fines. Then another marked urgent. I started finding notices stapled to my fence, tucked in my mailbox, even one rolled into the handle of my truck. Then came the meeting summons. Karen stood up in the community rec hall like she was queen of a kingdom, wearing all white. Designer clipboard. She smiled when I walked in late and sat in the back. "We're so glad Mr. Raines could join us," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. That was the first time I realized this wasn't about aesthetics. This was personal. I was the outsider, the man with the wild hill, the widower who didn't trim his grass with nail scissors or host wine tastings on Saturdays. I didn't fit into the brochure version of the neighborhood they wanted to sell. But the orchard was mine. Every shovel of soil I turned, every grafted branch, every night I'd spent walking those rows with a flashlight checking for frost. Every spring I held my breath waiting for the first bloom. I went home that night and stood under the cherry tree near the edge of the property. It was starting to bud again. There was a breeze, and the stars were out, and I could smell the promise of fruit. I whispered her name. I won't let them take this from us. But I didn't realize just how far Karen would go, or how close she already was to making her move. The notice came folded in a thick manila envelope, slid neatly between my screen door and the frame, as if they were delivering a birthday card, instead of what it really was, a demolition order. Stamped with the HOA's seal and marked, Final Determination. The letter inside detailed a board vote held without my presence, in which they unanimously decided that my orchard violated community view protections and presented a threat to erosion management. The wording was sterile bureaucratic, but what it meant was simple. They'd given themselves the right to cut down my trees. I read it 3 times before the words started to make sense. They'd set a compliance deadline of 14 days. If I didn't remove all non-compliant foliage from the hillside parcel, the HOA would exercise its right to enter and correct the violation billing me for labor equipment and disposal. 14 days to erase 15 years. It felt like a punch to the gut. I drove straight to the HOA office, which sat inside a stucco strip plaza, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a pet spa. The receptionist looked up from her tablet without removing her earbuds. When I asked to speak to Karen, she gave a rehearsed sigh and gestured to a clipboard labeled Appointments, HOA Matters Only. I didn't sign it. Instead, I stood there jaw-tight, arms folded, until Karen came out of a side office with her Bluetooth headset in one ear and sunglasses still perched on her head like she was fresh off a reality show. She smiled when she saw me. "Mr. Rains," she said, voice syrupy. "I assume this is about the orchard." "No," I said. "It's about trespassing. If you set foot on my land, I will file criminal charges." She tilted her head like she was dealing with a difficult dog. "We're simply enforcing the CCNRs. This community has standards and your hill. My hill is not community property, but your land falls within view ordinance zones that impact common aesthetics." I stared at her, barely believing what I was hearing. "That orchard was planted 15 years ago, before your glass box was even built." She didn't blink. "And it's never been formally approved." That's when I realized the game she was playing. Karen wasn't just trying to clean up the neighborhood. She was trying to rewrite it, redefine it, prune it like one of those sculpted hedges she imported from a commercial nursery. My orchard didn't fit her vision, so she was cutting it out. "I'm appealing," I said. "You're welcome to," she said with a smile. "But the board has authority, and the compliance clock doesn't pause for appeals." I filed the appeal anyway. It bought me some time, 5 days to be exact. Just enough to speak with an attorney friend from my Army years who now handled property rights cases. He looked over the CCNRs and sighed. "You're in a gray zone," he said. "They've built a case on visual uniformity clauses. Weak but not unprecedented. Do you have any easements, historic use filings, permits from when you planted?" I shook my head. "I never thought I needed them." "Well, you're not technically wrong," he said. "But they're betting you won't have the time, money, or energy to fight this." That made me angrier than the notice itself, because they were right. They knew I lived alone. They knew I didn't come to board meetings, didn't schmooze the neighbors, didn't put up Christmas lights. They assumed I'd roll over. Just another old man with a garden and no fire left. I went home that night and stood at the base of the hill. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that reminded me of deployment, those long, tense silences between radio calls. I kept looking at the trees, counting them in my head. The big cherry tree near the driveway. The 2 apricots near the ridgeline. The line of peach saplings I just planted last spring. They were all marked for removal. I spent the next day pulling out old boxes from my garage, digging through records receipts, anything that could prove usage history. I found a photo of my wife planting the very first tree. I found an old landscaping invoice from a contractor we'd hired 10 years ago to help with slope reinforcement. I made copies, scans, organized them into folders. But even as I prepared, I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. Karen was too quiet. I started getting calls from neighbors, whispers about tree-clearing trucks that had already been booked. One woman, Maria, who lived 2 streets over and used to bring her daughter to pick cherries in July, said she overheard Karen at a brunch saying the orchard would be gone by next Friday. That's when I knew they weren't waiting for legal process. They were coming. 3 days later, I saw the trucks. 2 of them unmarked heavy equipment trailers with chainsaws and brush shredders on the beds, parked half a block from my house in the early morning. Men in vests and work gloves sat inside the cabs drinking coffee. They didn't come up the driveway, but they didn't need to. Their presence was a threat. I called the police. The officer who arrived was young, polite, said it was a civil matter and that without physical entry, no trespass had occurred. He suggested I take it up with the HOA or my attorney. I could feel something break inside me. It wasn't just frustration. It was something older, something bone deep. That feeling from years ago overseas, when bureaucracy killed faster than bullets. When orders came from people who had never seen the terrain, but thought they understood it from a map. I wasn't going to let that happen here. Not again. I sat down that night surrounded by documents and maps and made a vow not just to protect what was mine, but to rebuild it stronger. They could tear down trees, but they wouldn't take the hill, and they would never take the roots. It happened at 6:42 a.m. on a Thursday. I was in the kitchen, coffee still brewing, when I heard the first mechanical roar cut through the quiet. Not a car, not a lawnmower, chainsaws. Multiple. I dropped the mug I was holding. It shattered on the tile, but I didn't stop to clean it. I ran outside barefoot, heart hammering, still in my shirt from sleep. My front porch has a clear view up the eastern ridge, where the orchard climbs the hill in staggered rows, and that morning I saw movement where there should have only been wind in the leaves. 3 men in orange vests were already inside the fence line. Not at the base, not hovering at the edge. Deep inside my land, trampling between rows of peach trees. 2 carried chainsaws. 1 dragged a bundle of neon marking tape. And Karen, she was there too. Standing just behind the split rail fence, arms folded across her white vest, mirrored sunglasses on as if she were supervising a landscaping job. My brain stuttered for a second, trying to process the legality, the logistics, the gall. Then I sprinted. The grass was cold under my feet. There was no time for shoes, no time to grab my phone, no time to think. I cleared the hill in seconds, lungs burning, fury already boiling over, as the first cherry tree came crashing down like a snapped bone. "Hey," I roared, voice sharp and loud enough to startle a bird from a nearby branch. "You're on private property." The men turned. 2 of them froze, mid-motion, one still holding a chainsaw that was idling in his gloved hands. The third looked to Karen, who made no move. She didn't flinch. She didn't step forward. She just gave the smallest nod, the kind that said, "Keep going." I stepped between them and the next tree. "You touch another inch of that bark," I growled, "and you'll be answering to more than just me." One of the workers raised his hands in that neutral, "I don't want trouble" gesture. But the guy with the chainsaw laughed. "We've got authorization," he said. "HOA orders. We're contracted to clear the hill." "This isn't HOA land," I said, pointing directly at the boundary marker, a steel stake driven into the ground with a faded survey ribbon still wrapped around it. "You are trespassing." He shrugged. "Take it up with your board." Then the saw started again. That sound, the high-pitched screech of steel against wood, sliced through something deeper than hearing. It hit me in the gut, in the chest, in the part of me that still saw my wife's hands pressing a sapling into the soil. I shoved the man. Hard. Not enough to hurt him, but enough that he dropped the saw. He stumbled back, swore, and for a moment it looked like he was going to swing. But the other 2 stepped in, pulling him back, saying something about calling it in. Karen's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "Mr. Rains, you are assaulting contractors operating under lawful HOA jurisdiction. You've now added criminal battery to your violations." I turned to her, shaking with a fury I hadn't felt since my last deployment. "You think this is over landscaping?" I said, voice low. "You have no right." She smiled, calm as a snake on warm stone. "I have a unanimous board decision and a notice of non-compliance. You had your chance to appeal." "I did appeal," I snapped, "and it's under review. You had no right to act while that process is still open." She gave a little shrug. "Due process doesn't stop enforcement. Your non-conforming structures were an ongoing violation." "Trees aren't structures," I spat. She raised a tablet and tapped the screen. "They are when they obstruct the community vista. You'll be billed accordingly." That's when I saw the man with the saw heading back toward the trees. And I did something I hadn't done in decades. I took out my phone, dialed 911, and said the words, "I need police assistance. I'm witnessing illegal destruction of private property. I have boundary markers. They're trespassing armed with saws. This is a safety emergency." I made sure Karen heard every word. And then I started filming. The chainsaw men didn't like that. One barked something about privacy. Another turned away, throwing his vest over his face. Karen didn't blink. "I hope you understand," I said, panning slowly from the downed tree to the men with tools to Karen's face. "This is evidence now." "Don't be dramatic, Mr. Rains," she replied. "You're welcome to bring this to court." "Oh, I will." It took 14 minutes for the sheriff's deputy to arrive. I remember the exact number because I counted every second trying to memorize the faces of the men who had violated my land. The deputy, older, sharp-eyed, asked for property lines. I showed him the stakes, the map, the deed I'd kept laminated since the day we closed escrow. He asked for permits. Karen waved her tablet. He stepped back, sighed, and said the words I was dreading. "This might be a civil matter, folks. You'll both need to sort this out through the court system." But I didn't back down. I handed him a copy of the appeal filing I'd submitted to the HOA Review Committee, time-stamped 2 days earlier. Karen's jaw twitched. He read it carefully. "Ma'am," he said to her finally, "it looks like this appeal is still active. That means enforcement might be premature. I'm going to ask your contractors to leave the property until this is resolved." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but he cut her off. "Unless you want to risk a counterclaim for property destruction while under active appeal." Silence. Then, with a tight-lipped nod, she signaled to the workers. They packed up. One kicked a chunk of bark as he went. Another muttered something under his breath. I stood at the edge of the hill and watched them leave. Watched them drive off with saws rattling in the truck bed. Watched Karen follow in her silver SUV, not looking back. Then I turned to the orchard. 4 trees gone. Dozens more marked with pink tape. Deep scars in the soil. Fruit crushed under boot prints. Limbs hacked, raw bleeding sap like open wounds. I knelt. Not out of weakness, but reverence. And I made another vow not just to stop her, but to build something she could never erase. A wall. A green wall. A living, growing testament that would make her wish she had never touched this land. The next morning, I didn't get out of bed right away. I stared at the ceiling and let the weight settle on my chest like a sandbag. 4 trees gone. That number repeated in my head like a military cadence. 4 trees gone. One of them was the oldest cherry on the hill, the one my wife had planted with a love note buried in the soil beneath it. They didn't just cut wood. They tore through history, through grief, through the last living thread connecting me to her. By the time I walked the hill again, the damage had already begun to rot. Broken limbs browned under the sun. Pits of churned-up dirt where trunks used to stand. The pink tape still fluttered on dozens of others, catching the wind like a warning. And that's when I stopped grieving. I started planning. I took photos of everything, wide shots of the hill, close-ups of saw marks, timestamps, and video footage of the contractors inside the boundary lines. I printed them out and labeled each one like an evidence board. Then I made copies, 3 sets. One for legal, one for city records, one just for me. Because I knew Karen wasn't done. She'd been pushed back, not beaten. And HOA, types like her, they don't accept no as an answer. They bide their time, bury you in paperwork, wear you down until you surrender just to breathe. But I'd been through worse. Combat zones, loss, bureaucracy thicker than jungle vines. I knew how to fight slow. So I started with letters. Not angry emails or petty neighborly notes, but formal, notarized correspondence drafted with the help of my attorney friend, who by now had grown personally offended by the story I told him. We filed a cease and desist to the HOA board citing unlawful entry and property destruction under California Civil Code FR 1942, among others. We demanded the names of the contractors. We requested video evidence of the HOA vote. We filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the city for any zoning complaints lodged by the HOA regarding my parcel in the last 12 months. And every letter, every certified document, every motion, I copied Karen. I knew it would rattle her. Sure enough, the silence didn't last long. 3 days later, I received a thick envelope hand-delivered by a teenage intern from the HOA. Inside, a 34-page violation summary. It listed every infraction they had cataloged over the years: unauthorized fencing, improper mulch use, alleged pest-attracting compost piles, and of course excessive vegetation density, obstructing community scenic corridors. They were laying the groundwork. Death by 1,000 citations. But I wasn't scared. Because while they were digging for violations, I was digging for leverage. I started going through county records at the library, real dusty archives, tracing property lines, easements, and historical land use documents. What I found buried in a filing cabinet from 1980 changed everything. There was an easement on the southern slope of my hill, a forgotten clause, in an old zoning document that classified the land as natural barrier area for fire mitigation. It explicitly encouraged reforestation and discouraged artificial grading. The cherry on top, it predated the HOA. That meant their CC&Rs couldn't override it. It was obscure, buried in legal jargon, but valid. My attorney confirmed it. "This is gold," he said. "You've got them pinned to the wall. They have no jurisdiction over vegetation density on that slope." But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted them not just blocked, I wanted them embarrassed. So I went public. I reached out to the local paper, not one of the big ones, just the Ridgeview Gazette, a weekly community circular that covered bake sales and high school football scores. But I knew who wrote for it, an old friend of my wife's, Janine, who had once been a serious journalist before settling down in suburbia. I sent her photos, the story, the permits, the appeal documents, the scars on the hill. She showed up the next afternoon with a camera and a notebook, her eyes flaring when I showed her where the cherry tree had been. They did this. For the view, she asked. For their view, I said. Not the community's, just Karen's. 2 days later, the Gazette ran a front-page story, Widower Fights HOA After Beloved Orchard Destroyed for Curb Appeal. There was a photo of me standing next to the stump of the cherry tree. The caption read, 15 years of memories cut down in minutes. The fallout was immediate. My phone rang nonstop, neighbors, strangers, even some folks from 2 blocks over who'd never spoken to me before. Maria brought over banana bread and cried at my kitchen table. One elderly veteran named Earl, who'd fought tooth and nail with the HOA over his flagpole, sent me a binder of legal notes he'd saved from his own battles. I wasn't alone anymore. And Karen, she wasn't smiling now. I passed her at the mailbox that week. Her hair was perfect. Her expression wasn't. She tried to speak something about miscommunication and overzealous contractors, but I walked right past her. I wasn't interested in half apologies. I was busy planting seeds. Not just the emotional kind, the literal kind. I went to the nursery and came back with a truckload of saplings, but not the same layout as before. This time I planted tighter, denser. A new formation strategically designed with help from an arborist I found through the city's urban forestry program. And this time, every single tree would be protected by law, by precedent, and by purpose. Because I wasn't just rebuilding an orchard. I was building a wall. A green-growing, undeniable statement. You can cut down a tree, but you cannot uproot the man who planted it. It started with a single word. Riparian. I found it scrawled in faded ink on an old blueprint copy buried in the Ridgeview County Archives, stamped with a zoning map from 1991. I'd gone down there looking for old permit records, anything that might cement my claim to reforest the slope. The clerk, an older guy named Walter, who smelled like pipe tobacco and mint, had rolled out the oversized maps on a dusty table and muttered, "You're lucky no one ever digitized this stuff." At the edge of my parcel, the very hill Karen had started calling the view corridor in her HOA memos, was a narrow zone shaded in blue, barely visible. Riparian buffer zone, it read. My breath caught. I pulled my phone and Googled it right there in the archive. It was a designation applied to land adjacent to natural streams or drainage paths meant to protect native vegetation and reduce erosion. The kicker. Under the California Riparian Habitat Conservation Program, development restrictions applied to any modifications within those zones, especially when it came to removing trees or altering natural growth. And I had it in writing, on an original document. I practically ran back to Walter. Can I get this certified? He nodded. Gonna cost you $23, but it's yours. It was the legal keystone I needed, something stronger than appeals or HOA charters. It was environmental law, state-backed, enforced by agencies even HOA Karens feared. That night, I called my attorney and read him every word. He whistled low. You just pulled the pin on a legal grenade. We filed a formal notice to the HOA. Not just a cease and desist this time, but an environmental non-compliance warning. We included the maps, the certification, and a demand to suspend all HOA landscape actions pending investigation by the County Environmental Board. Karen responded within 24 hours. She was rattled. I could hear it in her tone when she called, her voice not nearly as smug, no soft smile hiding behind empty phrases. Mr. Rains, she said, perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to propose a conversation, just you and me. Over coffee, maybe. Let's find a middle ground. Middle ground. After she'd reduced my orchard to stumps, mocked me in front of my neighbors, and tried to erase my wife's legacy. No, there was no middle ground anymore. There was only my ground. I declined her offer in writing. Instead, I made a new call, this time to the city's Urban Forest Recovery Initiative. It was a grant-based program offering assistance to landowners interested in restoring tree canopy in fire risk and erosion-sensitive areas. Ridgeview had just been added to the eligible zones after last year's wildfires sparked a county-wide push for reforestation. The program not only offered funding for replanting, but provided planning assistance permits and, most importantly, immunity from HOA landscaping restrictions in designated restoration zones. My parcel qualified. The inspector came 3 days later. A woman named Dion Sharp Eyes and Muddy Boots spent 2 hours walking the hill with me, measuring slope angles, testing soil, taking photos of what the chainsaws had done. Let me guess, she said, eyeing the pink marking tape still hanging limp from the peach stumps. They told you this was about the view. I nodded. She smiled tightly. They always say that. By the time she left, I had paperwork in hand, approval to begin ecological restoration on the ridge. 37 trees in total, native species, fire-resistant, drought-tolerant. Dion even offered a list of nurseries and a planting schedule that would maximize coverage. But I had a different vision. I wasn't planting for coverage. I was planting for impact. I went back to the same nursery where I'd bought the original orchard years ago, the one my wife had loved, run by a retired botanist and his daughter who remembered us from all those years ago. When I told them what had happened, the daughter Lena got quiet. Then she said, "Come with me." In the greenhouse, she showed me a new hybrid cultivar, fast-growing evergreens, thick-needled with vertical growth designed for slope stabilization. "They shoot up fast," she said. "Dense. They'll block everything behind them within a year." "Perfect," I said. "How many do you have?" "About 120. "I'll take 120. She blinked. "You sure?" I nodded. "I'm building a wall." It took 2 rented trucks, 3 neighbors, and a full week of digging, hauling, and mulching. Maria came with snacks and a folding chair and called it the rebellion. Even Earl showed up one morning with his grandson and 2 rusty shovels. Every hole we dug felt like undoing a wound. Every sapling we planted felt like planting defiance. The layout wasn't random. I staggered the rows in a chevron pattern wide at the base, narrowing as it rose, forming a natural barrier that funneled wind and diffused light. The city would see erosion control. Karen would see a fortress. And best of all, it was legal, every inch. Backed by a county program. Protected by state habitat law. Planted with assistance from the Department of Natural Resources. All wrapped in a bow of permits, photos, and zoning documents. Karen didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. But I caught her once up on her deck, wine glass in hand, staring down at the rising green wall that now sliced across the base of her backyard view like a curtain, slowly drawing closed. She wasn't smiling anymore. At night, I'd walk the rows with a flashlight like I used to, watching the young trees sway, listening to the wind pass through their branches. The hill was alive again, not just with plants, but with intention. I wasn't just rebuilding what she'd destroyed. I was creating something that couldn't be destroyed again. Every root was a boundary, every trunk a line she'd never cross. And deep in the soil beneath those saplings was something even stronger. Resolve. The first time the city drone flew over my hill, I was ready. I had the permit copies tacked to the inside of my shed door. The urban forestry binder, complete with stamped approval pages, soil test results, slope grading certifications, sat in a waterproof case by the gate. I'd memorized the project code and grant reference number. If someone sneezed the word zoning, I could quote back the chapter and statute in response. Because I knew Karen would come for me again. Not with chainsaws this time, but with complaints, accusations, code citations, and probably another avalanche of legalese written to sound like concern but aimed to suffocate. So I built a wall of paper before I built a wall of trees. And that wall held. 3 weeks after the last sapling went in the ground, I got a letter from the Ridgeview Municipal Oversight Committee, routine visual assessment of reforestation activities in environmentally sensitive zones. Standard, they said. Random. But I knew better. Karen had filed something. A formal review request, maybe. Or a resident concern about excessive planting obstruction of view, or neighborhood character alterations, which is HOA code for things I don't personally like. Didn't matter. Because every single pine, every drought-resistant cedar, and fire-sturdy spruce was documented, permitted, and strategically placed. The city's report came back in my favor. No violations noted. Project within scope and environmentally beneficial to designated zone. I pinned a copy to my front gate right above the splintered wood where the cherry tree used to lean. Neighbors started to notice. At first it was just polite nods. Then it was questions. What program did you use? How did you get funding? Could you help us apply to? Turns out I wasn't the only one fed up with Karen's HOA. One neighbor, Judith, had been fined last year for having lavender in her front yard, non-standard vegetation Karen had claimed, even though the HOA landscaping guide didn't ban it. Another Dave had been cited for a shed that was 2 inches too tall. 2 inches. He'd paid the fine just to avoid the fight. But now they had me. And I had a blueprint. We formed a group informal at first. Coffee meetings, email threads, shared Google Docs. We called it the Ridgeview Restoration Circle, mostly to sound harmless. But really, it was a coalition. A quiet rebellion. A homeowners union inside the HOA, using legal codes and city programs instead of picket signs. We had a motto: plant with purpose, push with paper. I helped Dave apply for a solar shade reclassification on his roof, which exempted his shed from height limits. I wrote a letter on Judith's behalf to the city's horticulture office citing pollinator protection laws for her lavender. I even helped Maria submit a grant application to convert her lawn into a native garden, the same grass Karen had once called chaotic. One by one, we found the cracks in the HOA's armor. The best part, we didn't need to scream. We didn't protest or sue or send angry rants to the board. We just used the system better than they did. That's what Karen never understood. She thought authority came from rules and bylaws, from meetings and majority votes and fine print. But real power comes from knowing where the lines are drawn. And who draws them? I was drawing new ones every week. The city planner Dion, the one who approved my wall of trees, invited me to speak at a local zoning workshop about slope recovery. I wore a clean flannel shirt and brought before and after photos. I told them about the orchard, about my wife, about what happened and what rose in its place. Afterwards, an older woman approached me. She introduced herself as Linda, Deputy Director of the Ridgeview Planning Council. "I've heard about your situation," she said. "I just wanted you to know you're not alone. We've had complaints about Ridgeview Oaks HOA before. You're not the first." She gave me her card. That little rectangle of cardstock weighed more than a weapon. Now I had a direct line into the city's development office. Karen didn't know it yet, but she'd lost more than a view. She'd lost control. It didn't stop her from trying. A week after the city report came back clean, she emailed the HOA mailing list a community vision update full of coded language. Phrases like sightline preservation and aesthetic continuity. She suggested a new bylaw that would require HOA board approval for any planting projects on elevated terrain visible from multiple homes. I read that line 3 times and laughed, because even if they passed it, and that was a big if, it wouldn't apply retroactively. And I had another surprise waiting. I'd been in quiet talks with the local high school's environmental science teacher, a guy named Mr. Levin, who ran the school's sustainability club. He was looking for a hands-on project to teach slope reforestation and native planting. I offered them the hill. Not the whole thing, just a 10-foot strip along the lower edge, technically still part of my property, but unused. I signed an agreement designating it a student-maintained urban ecology plot, complete with a learning garden, wildlife boxes, and rotational monitoring, which meant one thing: educational land use exemption. Now Karen couldn't touch that section without risking backlash from the school district, the city education council, and probably half the moms on the PTA. I installed a little wooden sign at the edge of the hill: Ridgeview Student Conservation Zone, please respect our growing future. The next morning, I saw her standing there again, glass in hand, staring at the trees. But this time, she wasn't alone. A group of kids, juniors and seniors from the high school, were digging mulch beds at the base of the slope, laughing, planting, playing music from a Bluetooth speaker. Karen turned and walked back inside. I exhaled, not from relief, from satisfaction. She had tried to erase me and in the process made me visible. She wanted to remove roots, but I'd planted them deeper, wider. And now they weren't just mine anymore. They belonged to the community, to the kids, to the next generation, to anyone who'd ever been told their land, their memories, their life didn't fit the rules. Let them file their motions. Let them pass their hollow bylaws. I had trees, and I had people who would help water them. From the deck behind my house, you can see the top of the ridge like a green crown. At first, the young trees looked small, fragile, just stakes in the soil, barely casting a shadow. But nature doesn't hesitate when it's allowed to breathe. And by late spring, the first line of spruce had already grown 3 feet taller, tight with new needles, their trunks beginning to thicken with promise. What once had been a scattered orchard now stood in organized ranks, not random saplings, but a living barricade. It was poetic. Karen had cut down my orchard to open her view. And now that same hill was growing into a wall of trees thicker and higher than any fence I could have legally built. It started slowly. First came the shade-small patches that crept up the slope behind her house during the early hours. Then the birds returned nesting in the branches, filling the morning with songs that seemed louder than necessary. Then came the pollen. Nothing harmful, but enough to drift on the breeze and dust her glass-paneled balcony in a soft, pine-scented layer. Karen filed her next complaint in May. Obstruction of shared view corridor due to unapproved vegetation growth. I laughed when I read it, because this time, the board didn't even vote on it. Two of the newer members ones, who'd joined after the Gazette article and the zoning workshop, told her plainly that my reforestation project was outside their jurisdiction. One of them even quoted the restoration clause I'd shared in a community email. That must have been the moment it dawned on her. The HOA was no longer her personal army. The board had begun to fracture not in a loud, dramatic way, but in little gestures. Pauses during meetings when she spoke. Questions raised about her interpretations of bylaws. And most of all, silence the kind that comes when people are no longer afraid to let you fall. The real shift came when a neighbor named Roger, someone I'd only ever waved to from a distance, stopped by with a clipboard. He was collecting signatures. Board election this fall, he said. We're organizing a recall vote. Karen's time is up. I hadn't even considered it, but he smiled, tapping the paper. It started with you. That hit me hard. Not because I wanted credit, but because I finally understood what the trees had become. Not just protection, not just healing, but resistance. Every row of evergreens, every layer of pine and cedar was a quiet stand against control disguised as community. And the neighbors, the ones who had once kept their heads down, now walked my hill with pride, admiring what we'd built. Kids from the high school came every other Saturday to maintain the lower patch, planting wildflowers, painting wooden bee boxes, collecting data for their ecology projects. They called it the Learning Wall. One even asked if he could build a bench at the top with a plaque in memory of what grew back stronger. I said yes. Karen sent 2 more letters that summer. One claimed my trees were casting excessive shadow into her home. The other accused me of creating an intentional visual obstruction to provoke emotional distress. My lawyer, barely containing his amusement, drafted a 3-word response, noted, no merit. She didn't stop there. A drone one I didn't recognize hovered low over my property one evening at sunset. It buzzed over the canopy, dipping low near the student zone before zipping off toward her house. The next day, I installed motion cameras. 2 nights later, someone spray-painted Communist Wall in red letters on my mailbox. I didn't retaliate. I called the police, filed the report, replaced the mailbox. And then I planted 3 more trees, right near the curb. The next morning, I stood with a thermos of coffee and watched the sunrise over the now impossible-to-miss line of trees that crowned my hill. Rows of green against the orange sky, casting long, proud shadows over the properties below. Karen stepped onto her balcony like she always did. But this time, she didn't linger. She turned and went back inside. The wall had won, not through violence, not through anger, but through growth. The kind of growth you can't undo. Slow, steady, rooted. The kind that speaks louder than lawsuits. One afternoon, a city official came by, someone from the environmental committee, checking in on the student plot. He stood beside me as we looked up at the trees now tall enough to hide almost everything beyond them. She really hates this, huh? He said with a chuckle. I didn't answer. He paused. You know, we've got other neighborhoods asking about how to start similar projects. You might have kicked off something bigger than just this hill. That caught me off guard. But when I thought about it, it made sense. Karen's destruction hadn't just sparked my retaliation. It had ignited a deeper need in others to reclaim their space, to push back against the rules written in ink, but not in spirit. And what better symbol than a wall made of trees? No noise, no vandalism, just life, growing, unrelenting life. The following week, I got an invitation. The Ridgeview City Council wanted me to speak at their annual Community Stewardship Forum. Topic: grassroots environmental action in suburban developments. I laughed when I read it. Me, a retired logistics officer with dirt under his nails and a rebuilt orchard behind his house, now speaking to a room full of planners and politicians. My wife would have been proud. I didn't write a speech. When the time came, I stood in front of the mic, held up a photo of the hill before and after, and simply said, "This is what happens when you stop asking permission to exist." The room went silent. Then it erupted in applause. Karen didn't attend. She was too busy trying to get her drone footage accepted as evidence in a civil complaint that was dismissed the following week without hearing. The trees kept growing. So did my peace. I should have known Karen wouldn't let it end with silence. The wall of trees might have blocked her view, but it hadn't blocked her ego. And an ego like Karen's doesn't bruise, it festers. Her retaliation arrived folded inside a legal envelope dropped at my door like a grenade. Ridgeview Oaks Homeowners Association versus Daniel Rains. The charges: willful obstruction of communal view corridors, deliberate impairment of adjacent property value, hostile landscape design, with intent to harass and violation of aesthetic continuity clauses under HOA Regulation 5.2.1 through 5.2.4. I read the list twice, then read it again slower, trying to process the absurdity. Hostile landscape design. That one stuck in my head for days. I wasn't surprised she sued. The only surprise was that it took her this long. She had lost every informal battle, been humiliated in her own HOA, and saw her neighborhood support shrink like a rain puddle in August. The courtroom was her last weapon, and she was betting it all on the drama. But this wasn't her HOA boardroom. This was civil court. This was my territory now. I called my attorney Greg, the same one who'd helped me with the restoration permits, and sent him every piece of documentation I had. He met me at the Hill the next morning. "She's not playing around," he said. "She's hired a firm that specializes in nuisance and zoning cases. They're arguing your tree wall was planted with intent to cause emotional distress." I laughed. Can trees harass someone now? He didn't smile. To the wrong judge, maybe. We built our case meticulously. Every document was cataloged: the riparian zone designation, the state habitat law exemption, the urban forest recovery grant approval, the drone photos, the planning documents from the school project. More importantly, we had community support. Maria, Judith, Dave. Even Mr. Levin and half a dozen students wrote statements. Some were official affidavits, others were simple letters about the orchard's history, the planting efforts, the environmental impact. One letter from Earl, typed on a typewriter with faded ribbon, simply said, "I fought in Korea. I've lived here 42 years. I've never seen anyone improve this land the way Daniel did. If planting trees is a crime, I'm guilty too." We walked into the courtroom with 2 thick binders and 36 exhibits. Karen arrived flanked by 2 attorneys and a rolling cart of printed HOA regulations. She wore white, of course always the white, and kept her expression calm but tight like a porcelain vase just before the crack. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a weary tone, began by skimming both filings. After half an hour, she leaned back and said, "So what I have here is a tree fight." Karen's attorney immediately objected to the characterization, arguing this wasn't just about trees, but about property value impairment, aesthetic degradation, and psychological harm inflicted by deliberate obstructions. Greg leaned in. "Your Honor, everything my client planted was permitted by the city, approved under state environmental programs, and has improved both ecological stability and community engagement. The HOA does not own the hillside. Ms. Lansing's distress is personal, not legal." The judge raised a brow. "Do you have proof of intentional harassment?" Karen stood. She launched into a prepared speech about how she'd lived in the neighborhood for 5 years, how she had invested over $1.3 million into her home, how her once award-winning backyard views had been suffocated by Mr. Rains's tree wall. She even used the phrase visual violence. I had to look away to keep from laughing. Greg stayed calm. "Your Honor," he said, "if planting native trees on one's own property with city approval constitutes harassment, then every reforestation effort in California is a legal threat." The judge asked for a break. During recess, Karen approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She stood close, arms folded tight. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she hissed. "You turned the entire neighborhood against me." I didn't answer, because she still didn't understand I didn't turn anyone. They saw her for who she was, all on their own. We returned to the courtroom for final arguments. Karen's attorneys pushed hard, bringing out photos of her home, before and after complete, with mock real estate evaluations showing imaginary dips in value. They even brought in a supposed aesthetics expert who claimed the tree line caused a claustrophobic psychological effect. Greg didn't flinch. He presented a slideshow of the reforestation progress, highlighted by time-lapsed growth photos, student projects, community involvement, and aerial shots that showed the transformation of the hill from bare dirt to vibrant green. When he was done, he placed a copy of the state law highlighted and tabbed in front of the judge. This project is protected by environmental statute, guided by city planning, and supported by documented grant work. Ms. Lansing may dislike it, but that doesn't make it illegal or malicious. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day. She took everything under advisement. But when the decision came by mail 2 weeks later, I stood at the mailbox for a full minute before opening it. Case dismissed. No damages awarded. No removal orders. The court affirmed my right to plant and maintain the tree wall as an ecological restoration project on private land, fully compliant with state and local laws. But the best part, the judge included a written note of opinion. While the HOA's concern for neighborhood standards is understandable, personal preference does not override environmental integrity. The defendant's actions are lawful, restorative, and commendable. I framed that line and hung it on the wall in my kitchen. The legal fight was over. Karen had thrown everything at me: letters, fines, public shame, destruction, lawsuits. And all I did was plant trees. But that's the thing about roots. You can't always see them growing. But when the storm comes, they're the only thing holding the hill together. The day after I got the verdict, I walked the hill before sunrise. The trees were quiet in that golden light, tall, sure, whispering in the wind, like they were telling secrets to the earth. I ran my hand along the bark of the first spruce I'd planted, felt the cool texture of its trunk, the soft brush of its needles. I whispered, "We did it." Because in a way, it wasn't just me who had won. It was my wife. It was every hand that had helped dig, every neighbor who'd stood up, every kid who'd watered roots and journaled leaf growth. It was a win for the quiet ones, the people who never shout but always endure. That morning, I brewed a full pot of coffee and left the gate open. By 9:00 a.m., they started arriving. Maria brought muffins and tears. Judith came with a folding chair and 2 lawn signs she'd made: grow back stronger and let trees be. Dave rolled in with a cooler of orange sodas and a boombox playing Willie Nelson's On the Road Again. Even Earl showed up, grumbling about his bad knees, but smiling like a man who'd finally outlived his adversaries. And then came the students. Dozens of them, some I hadn't even met, carrying watering cans, sketchbooks, rakes, bags of native flower seeds. They laid out new mulch beds and painted small signs naming each tree after local pollinators: the Monarch Grove, Hummingbird Line, B-Side Ridge. It wasn't a celebration in the traditional sense. There were no banners, no streamers, no podium speeches. It was better. It was quiet, steady joy. We sat under the new canopy and told stories. People asked me about the orchard, the old one. I showed them the faded photo of my wife planting the first tree. A few people cried. I did too. But they weren't the tears of loss anymore. They were the kind that come when something broken begins to mend. Around noon, a local reporter arrived, Janine again, from the Ridgeview Gazette. She snapped photos of the student garden, the signs, the saplings now rising like sentries across the slope. She asked me for a quote. I looked out at the hill, the wall of green now fully formed, and said, "You can cut down a tree, but you can't cut down what it meant. And when enough people care, even what's lost can grow back stronger." She nodded without writing it down. "I don't need to," she said. "That one's going to stay with me." Karen didn't show. Not that day, not the next. In fact, after the verdict, something in her shifted, not just in behavior, but in presence. Her blinds stayed drawn. Her yard grew slightly unkempt. The glass balcony, once spotless, began to gather dust. 2 weeks later, the HOA sent out an email announcing a special board election. Karen didn't run. She didn't resign either. She just faded. And when the votes came in, the board changed hands for the first time in nearly a decade. Roger was elected president. Judith got a seat. So did a man named Miguel, who ran a native landscaping business and had clashed with Karen before. Their first motion: revise the CC&Rs to include a right to restorative planting for all homeowners with environmental certification. It passed unanimously. Karen never spoke a word about it. She didn't have to, because by then she knew she'd lost something deeper than an election. She'd lost control. The fear was gone. People were laughing again, planting again, painting again. The HOA had become what it was always meant to be: a community. And me, I finally built that bench at the top of the hill. It faces east, catching the first light of morning as it streams through the evergreens. On the back, carved into cedar, are 4 simple words: in memory of her roots. Sometimes I sit there with my thermos and just listen. To the wind. To the trees. To the silence that once felt lonely but now feels earned. Occasionally, I still get visitors, strangers, even who heard about the wall, about the orchard, about the fight. They want to see it for themselves. They ask questions, take photos, walk slowly among the rows. I always let them, because what we built isn't just a wall. It's a story. A story written in bark and soil, in sap and sunlight. A story that says you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You just have to stand your ground long enough for your roots to hold. It's been 2 years since the first chainsaw tore through my orchard. 2 years since the trees fell, since the soil bled, since Karen stood smugly behind a clipboard and smiled while something I loved was cut down in the name of someone else's view. I still think about that morning sometimes. Not with anger, not anymore, but with a kind of solemn reverence, the way veterans remember battlefields. There was grief. There was fire. But most of all, there was choice. The choice not to give up, not to fold, not to accept that power always wins. Because that morning something else began to grow. Not just in the soil, in me, in all of us. Now the hill is something different. Not better, just fuller. It carries memory like wind carries pollen, floating everywhere unseen, but everywhere. The new trees stand tall and silent, more than twice my height now, their branches woven together like a shield. The lower half of the slope, once patchy and eroded, is lush with native grass and milkweed and sunflowers from the school's pollinator project. And beyond the green peace, Karen moved out last fall. No announcement, no goodbye. A real estate sign popped up one Thursday, and by Sunday it was gone. Her house sits empty now, listed as pending sale, her name removed from the HOA contact directory. I don't know where she went. I don't care. This place was never hers, not really. She tried to shape it in her image, but the land rejected that. It remembered the roots, it remembered the orchard. And it welcomed back every hand that came to heal it. Even now, neighbors walk the hill. Some come with dogs, others with coffee, a few with notebooks or camera lenses. I've seen teenagers kiss behind the pines, seen toddlers wobble across the mulch paths, seen older couples hold hands and lean on one another as they climb. It's become a place of stillness, of strength, of restoration. I built a wooden kiosk near the bottom, just a simple post with a plexiglass case that holds the story, the orchard, the lawsuit, the wall of trees. There's a before and after photo, a small QR code linking to the Gazette article, and a line at the bottom that says, "Planted in resistance, grown in peace." People leave notes sometimes, folded papers, thank you cards, even drawings from children. I keep them in a drawer in the house. Each one a reminder that something born of harm can still become beautiful. Sometimes I rewrite the court ruling too, not out of pride, but as proof that truth can hold in the face of power. That legality, when paired with heart and community, can cut through even the densest red tape. I've been asked if I'd ever move. The answer is no. Not because I'm stubborn, though I am, but because this land has become more than a home. It's a living monument now. Every branch is a sentence. Every root, a memory. Every inch of shade it casts is something I fought for, something I earned, something I planted with my own hands, and a shovel full of grief. And what once was a wound, that cherry tree stump scarred and gnarled, is now surrounded by a small circle of wildflowers. The students call it the heart ring. They planted it on their own. I didn't even ask. One day, I sat beside it, and a boy, maybe 16, asked me if I had any regrets. I thought about it. Regret. I regretted not putting up more of a fight when the first letter came. I regretted not taking photos of the whole orchard in bloom before it fell. I regretted not planting even more trees back then when she was still alive to see them. But I didn't regret the fight. I didn't regret standing up even when my voice was hoarse, even when no one else was clapping. Because in the end, the trees clapped for me. Every time the wind moves through them, every rustle is a chorus. Every creak is applause, and I listen. Because I am finally free. Not from the HOA, they still send me newsletters and community notices, though now they read more like invitations than orders. Not from rules, I still follow codes, still pay dues, still plant responsibly. But I am free from fear. And that is the quietest, deepest kind of freedom. It doesn't come with fanfare. It doesn't shout or wave a flag. It grows, one branch at a time, one season at a time. It stretches across the sky, shading what was once bare, protecting what was once vulnerable. So I wake up each morning, brew my coffee, and walk the rows. I check the moisture in the soil. I pick up litter near the fence. I water where the sun hits hardest, and I sit on the bench at the ridge and let the sun pour over the trees, my trees, and know that I stood when it mattered most, that I didn't let her win, that what they tried to destroy became a forest, and that forest will stand long after any of us are gone.